Hello and welcome back to the After Effects crash course. In this video, you'll learn about using layers and masks in After Effects. Like the first video, this will be split into chapters so you can skip around as needed. First, let's go through the different types of layers in After Effects. Right-click on the timeline and select New. This brings up a menu of different types of layers you can create. The first type of layer is text, which is pretty self-explanatory. You can put text on the screen and animate it, or customize it in the character panel like I showed you in the last video. Next, let's look at solid layers. A solid is essentially a rectangle, which by default will fill the entire screen. You can change the dimensions and color in this menu. For the purposes of this video, I'll skip light and camera layers, as they're only used for 3D compositing, not 2D animation. Next, we have null objects. Null objects are completely invisible and don't do anything on their own. Instead, they serve as a guide for other layers. This means you can animate a null, then set another layer to follow it. This is especially useful for making a large number of layers follow the same animation at the same time. For a more in-depth look at this, you can watch my video about the sports motion graphic, which I'll link in the video description. I'll also cover nulls in Chapter 4 of this course. Below that is the shape layer. I touched upon shape layers briefly in the last video, but what's important to know about them is that a single shape layer can hold more than one shape. To create a new shape on an existing layer, just click on the existing shape layer and add a new shape using one of the tools. Note that each shape on the layer has its own set of transform controls, so you can transform each shape independently. You can also transform the layer as a whole. Lastly, let's look at adjustment layers. I won't spend much time on them in this video because they don't have much of an application in motion graphics. They're far more useful for compositing, which is the process of blending layers together to create visual effects. However, it's still useful to know what an adjustment layer does. Adjustment layers are invisible. Their purpose is to apply effects to other layers. When you apply an effect to an adjustment layer, the effect shows up on all of the layers below it. This is useful for implementing visual effects into a scene and making them look more realistic. It can also be used for color grading. For now, we can ignore the other layer types. We won't be using them. Now that you've seen all the different types of layers in After Effects, let's look at the different options that all layers have. In the bottom left corner of the timeline panel, you can see 4 little buttons here, which each make minor changes to the panel's layout. This first button on the left toggles a set of controls on each layer. The first control, called Shy, at first appears to do nothing. Note that there is a matching icon at the top of the panel. If it is enabled, some layers will be hidden from the timeline view. You can toggle each layer individually. This feature is purely for keeping things organized, so you aren't always looking at a huge stack of layers that aren't important. Note that even when I hide a layer on the timeline, it remains visible in the composition. Next, we have this little star icon. What it does is a bit complicated, and for the most part you don't have to worry about it. Instead, just remember that if you're ever having issues with the Set Matte effect, which I'll cover in Part 4 of this series, it can often be solved by enabling this. To the right is the Quality and Sampling button. This toggles a process called anti-aliasing, which is much simpler than it sounds. All it does is smooth out rough edges, especially diagonal lines. If I zoom in on some text and toggle anti-aliasing for that layer, you can clearly see the effect. You may want to enable or disable this for certain layers, depending on the situation. Next, there's the FX button. Simply, this enables or disables any effects that have been applied to a layer. This button will only be visible for layers that have effects applied. Next to the FX button is the frame blending option. Frame blending is a process of artificially increasing the frame rate of footage, creating new frames by combining existing ones. This option is only available for externally created video files, not layers created within After Effects like solids, text, or shapes. Again, I'll put a video in the description that goes into more detail about frame blending if you want to learn more. The next switch is motion blur, which is exactly what it sounds like. If motion blur is enabled, objects will become blurry as they move in the frame. You can enable it per layer, as well as for the entire composition with the switch at the top. To change the amount of motion blur in the composition, right-click on the comp in the Project panel and select Composition Settings. Click on the Advanced tab and change the shutter angle. By default, it is set to 180 degrees, which most closely matches what we see in real life. The next switch turns any layer into an adjustment layer, which I covered earlier in this video. When enabled, the layer will become invisible, and any effects applied will apply to all layers below it. The last switch enables 3D mode, which I'll cover in the last video of this course. Now that we've looked at all the layer switches, let's go to the second button at the bottom. This one opens up the transfer controls. First, there's a setting called blending mode, which changes how layers interact with the layers below it. It would take far too long for me to fully explain how they all work, so if you're interested, I'll link another video in the description all about it. For now, all you really need to know is that if you want to remove a black background from a video, set the blend mode to screen or add. If you need to remove a white background, set the blend mode to multiply. The two other options are called track matte and preserve underlying transparency. I don't personally use either of these features, but they both serve as alternatives to the set matte effect, which, as I mentioned earlier, I will cover in part 4. I'm more familiar with using set matte, so that's what I'll teach in this course. The next switch opens up a few simple time controls for each layer. You can adjust the in and out points, or the points when the layer starts and ends. You can also adjust the duration and time stretch, which each affect each other. So you can change the clip duration to a specific length, or you can change it to a specific speed. The last switch at the bottom opens up a display that shows how long each layer takes to render. This is useful if your computer is having performance issues and you need to see which layers are causing the problem, so you can disable them or their effects. Now that we've looked at all the different types of layers and their properties, let's look at using masks to control layers. A mask is just a shape that hides and shows different parts of a layer. For example, if I use the rectangle tool with another layer selected, that layer takes the shape of the rectangle that I create. You can create a mask on a layer using any of the shape tools, as well as the pen tool. You can also edit the points on a mask with the pen tool. You can add several masks to a single layer. By default, a new mask will show what is inside of it and hide everything else. However, if you change the blend mode of the mask to subtract or check the inverted box, the mask will hide what's inside and show everything else. Each mask has a few settings. The path is the shape of the mask, which you can keyframe to change over time. Using this, you could mask a moving subject out of a video and put it over a different background. Mask feather is just the softness of the edge of the mask. At 0, it will have straight edges. The more you increase feathering, the softer the edges will become. Next, each mask has its own opacity control so you can edit the visibility of its contents. Lastly, mask expansion controls how big the outer edge of the mask is. Now you have learned about how to use layers within After Effects. In the next video, we'll talk about using effects and creating presets. Until then, I'm Liam Osborne.